And now on the BBC News Channel, it's time for your questions answered, and you have been sending in your questions about the tighter rules that have come into effect for many people across England. And I'm delighted to say that we are joined by Dr. Chris Smith, consultant virologist at the University of Cambridge, and we're also joined by Dr. Bharat Pankhania, senior clinical lecturer at University of Exeter Medical School. And a very warm welcome to you both. Good to have you with us on this Saturday afternoon, and we've got a lot of questions, so I'll get straight to it. And Chris, if I could start with you, this is from Alison Baker, and she lives in London, but her mother lives in Wiltshire. Alison was due to visit her mother next weekend for her 80th birthday, but says she's confused, like so many, as what she's allowed to do, because Wiltshire isn't in Tier 2, which of course London is, and we are. Am I allowed to travel to see her?
Hello, Alison. The answer is, and this is confusing, but the person inherits the risk according to the area they're from. So if you're from an area that's in Tier 2, judged high risk, this means that you are yourself judged high risk. And if you were to go to an area of low risk, you don't become low risk, you have to continue to practice the rules as though you are still in your home area. So the answer is that you could still go and see the person you want to visit, but you'd have to adopt the outdoors rule of 6, meet outside, because you shouldn't be meeting other households inside if you're from a high-risk area or they are coming to you in a high-risk area.
But just to clarify, Alison could go to see her mother, celebrate her birthday, as long as they were outside.
That's right. Or if Alison provides care to her mum, and mum needs input in that respect, care is also exempted. So if you're a caregiver or you're travelling for work or educational reasons, those are also exempted. But if it's just a social visit for an area that's high risk, you can still meet, but it's rule of 6 outside. You can't combine households indoors.
OK. Bharat, I realise I'm calling you Bharat and Chris today. I'm being very familiar, so forgive me not using your full titles, but that picks up on a question from Denise Oakley, so let's explore this a little bit further. Denise wants to know, can I continue to provide childcare for my grandchildren whilst their parents work? They're in 2 different family groups. One is in Tier 2 in Essex, and the other is in Tier 1 in Thurrock. I'm not quite sure those tiers are right, but I think we understand the question, don't we?
Yes, we do. The important point is that, as Chris has just said, this is providing care, and providing care is allowed. Having said that, I note the question also says, I am the grandmother. So I infer that, she may be in an older age group. And as you grow older, you, of course, pick up pathologies. So my first concern would be for the grandmother. Are you in a fit and healthy state? Do you have any other coexisting medical conditions, etc.? So ask those questions first. And secondly, yes, she can, because she's providing child care. But first of all, make sure you are okay to do so.
So in other words, there are other considerations sometimes as well as the guidelines themselves.
Absolutely. Yes.
Chris, I think you have answered this question, but I think given that people have taken the trouble to get in touch with us, it's good to answer people's individual questions, if you don't mind. This is Sophie Cook. I am in Tier 1. My boyfriend is in Tier 2. Are we still able to see each other?
Well, again, you're taking a household from one area and seeking to mix it with a household in another area that's at a different risk. Now, if you both live alone, then you could form a social bubble together, and that is still acceptable because social bubbles across all the tiers are exempted. It doesn't matter what tier you're in. If you've got a social bubble, and there, remember, for households of single occupancy, you can bubble up. So that might be one way that you could still meet. But cast your mind back to when Jenny Harries, our Deputy Chief Medical Officer, was asked a similar question back at the beginning of the lockdown. And someone said, well, what happens if I don't live with my partner? And her answer was, now's the time to test the strength of your relationship, either by moving in together and testing it that way, or seeing if you can stay together without actually seeing each other. I mean, it sounded like she was making light of it. It is a serious point. And at the moment, if you are part of 2 different households, by the rules, you shouldn't actually be meeting indoors if one of those households is in tier 2, the higher risk category.
Chris, you mentioned social bubbles. Can you just remind us again of what the rules are if you're in a single household? How many people can be in your bubble?
If you're in a single occupancy household, then people in that sort of situation might be lonely, they might have special needs for support, they might have been bereaved, and the government recognised that. And so they made special provision for people who are in that situation, and those sorts of households can attach themselves, merging their mini bubble to another household, a bigger bubble, and you are judged as though you are one household, even though you may live in 2 separate locations and 2 separate venues, and in fact in 2 different risk areas. Social bubbles are, unlike the majority of the population, immune to the risk level, and so you can continue to meet under those circumstances across all those divides and across all those restrictions.
OK. Bharat, and I think the key word here you may pick up on is great, actually, but this is a question from Colin Woodward, who lives in Wolverhampton and wants to know whether his 4-year-old great-granddaughter can visit him from Newcastle-under-Lyme and stay for a few days. So again, those are 2 people in 2 different alert levels, aren't they, living in 2 different areas?
Yeah, so both Newcastle-under-Lyme and Wolverhampton are in tier 2 medium category, tier 2 high category, right? And so in tier 2s, you don't want to be mixing with different households. That is the whole point of keeping your social distancing and your interactions with other groups of human beings. So ideally, you don't want to be interacting from a tier 2, which is high, with a tier 2 again, high, and mixing up together. Because the key point here is you don't know the bubble of the granddaughter, how big it is, and you don't know the bubble of the grandparent, how big their other bubble is. Therefore, it is riskier to start coming together to meet up.
OK, and Chris, this follows on from that. Can 2 people from different households, but both living under the same restrictions in tier 1, spend time together, including, and this is a slightly different element to the question, staying in a hotel in a tier 2 area? That's from Kathy McKeand.
Yeah, this is slightly more complicated, isn't it? But if you've got 2 people from tier 1, then their risk is judged to be tier 1. So were they to stay at home, they could comfortably meet each other in their own homes because the rules allow for that at the moment. If you were to travel to a tier 2 area, well, actually, you're bringing with you the risk you already have, which is low risk. So were you to stay together in a hotel in tier 2, hotels and other venues must have, by the law, have implemented a COVID secure environment. So therefore, your risk shouldn't change in terms of exposure to the virus in the new place you're in. You're therefore not exposing each other to any more risk, and you're not being exposed to any more risk. So I would say my interpretation would be it's reasonable for you to go and stay in your hotel together because you're not bringing any additional risk with you or engendering any further risk to yourselves by being there, as long as that venue are complying with the rules. Might be worth phoning them in advance, though, because venues are now required to collect the information of the people who come to stay. They may not be completely familiar with who's coming and what rules to apply to those things. So rather than create difficulty, it might be worth phoning ahead and just clarifying the situation with them, just to avoid that happening when you actually get there.
OK, that's good advice, Chris. Thank you. Now, Bharat, Karen Giles would like to know, are the people who were shielding last time being told to do it again?
Well, shielding by implication means you are in a vulnerable state, right? You've got other illnesses, immune suppression, whatever. And my advice would be anybody who was with that badge shielding should take cover now. Be careful, be very careful. So whilst the term shielding implies we will get you food parcels and other support things, which has not yet been fully clarified by the government, my empirical advice is anyone in a shielding category should be extra cautious now because the case numbers are going up, and therefore please take all measures possible, whatever the label.
OK, that's useful, thank you. Chris, this is a question. We live in Essex, which is currently Tier 2. My daughter visits a different household, also in Essex, to teach their children foreign languages. This is paid work. Is this allowed? That's from Gavin Rees. So this is different from the caregiving that you've been talked about, and also raises a question that several people have asked me, is can people's cleaners still go into other households to work?
If you look at the government's advice, you can find the category on the web, and I know not everyone has easy access to the web, so hence I'll try and be as clear as I can here in case people can't refer to that too. If you look up the area for high risk, or the page for high risk, you'll see that it then says meeting friends and family, and what the exceptions are. And a number of exceptions are made, and those exceptions include, as well as giving care, which we've already covered, they include work and also education. Now, I think, therefore, under two categories here, you're providing a work service and you're providing an educational service to the other people in the household. And so under those considerations, it would be OK. But if you look further down the list, it does advise people not to travel and to work from home where possible. So my first piece of advice would be to ask the obvious question, is there any way that you could do this without having to visit at all? Because that puts you and them in the safest possible position. If you can't do this remotely, and by remotely I mean could you do your teaching online, for example, which lots of schools and universities are doing? If you can't, I think legally it would be absolutely appropriate for you to make those visits, as long as they don't have symptoms, they're not aware of any outbreak that they've been exposed to, and neither have you, and neither of the parties are being asked to isolate or quarantine themselves. But if possible, I'd advise try to minimise the travel and do it online if you can.
OK, thanks for that clarity. And Barrett, a question from Claire Gwinan. Again, I think we've touched on this, but let's answer her question directly. She lives in Tier 2. Can she meet friends for a meal at a pub in Tier 1?
Well, again, yes, we have answered this, but so she takes her risk from Tier 2, which is high, and she continues to have that high risk. And you are going now to a place to have a meal with somebody from Tier 1, which is medium risk. But we don't want Tier 2 mixing with Tier 1, because you are carrying your Tier 2 risk with you. Ideally, I would say, don't do it.
OK, we've got to leave it there. In fact, we've managed to get through most people's questions. Apologies if we didn't get to yours, but of course,